This is the New Hope online sermon for February the 20th, 2022. The big picture. We're in a sermon series that I've called Living in the Plural, and the guiding thought is that the gospel has an indispensable corporate dimension to it. The good news is that through Christ, we, plural, are being restored to fellowship with God and also to each other, so that together we may be the body of Christ in this world. And we're using Paul's first letter to the Corinthians to guide us through some notions related to that. The slightly narrower picture is this. Last week we were in 1 Corinthians 14. And that's the part of the letter that deals with worship problems in Corinth. You'd hope for public worship to be where the church is at its very best, together, working off the same page. But instead, Corinthian worship seems to have been a hot mess, chaos, people praying unintelligible spirit prayers, and even several people talking simultaneously. Lots of energy, but it was a little bit, sounds like the Jerry Springer show or something. And in case you're wondering, Paul doesn't think that worship should be like the Jerry Springer show. So chapter 14 is his effort to rein things in a little bit and make worship orderly and intelligible. Last week we read from toward the end of that chapter, starting with verse 26. This week I'm going to back up a little bit, end the letter a little bit more, a little earlier in the letter, and read verses 13 through 19 of 1 Corinthians 14. Part of what Paul has to say about this complicated issue of speaking in tongues. He writes, "For this reason, the one who speaks in a tongue should pray that they may interpret what is said. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So what shall I do? I pray with my spirit, but I will also pray with my understanding. I will sing with my spirit, but I will also sing with my understanding. Otherwise, when you are praising God in the Spirit, how can someone else who is now put in the position of an inquirer say, 'Amen' to your thanksgiving, since they do not know what you are saying? You are giving thanks well enough, but no one else is edified. I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you. But in the church, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue." Now, if you were here last week, you know that I played good cop, and I congratulated New Hope on, I congratulated us on what the Corinthians were so bad at. I congratulated us on our orderliness. We're a smallish congregation that's maybe sometimes clumsy. We certainly don't do everything perfectly, but we're orderly. We have a framework for what we do. We don't talk over each other. Nobody debates the minister mid-sermon. So last week, it was good for us, right? But as I said at the end of the sermon last week, if you stay with a seemingly friendly Bible text long enough, sometimes it sneaks up behind you and bites you in the rear. And I think this chapter sort of does that. And I think what it bites into is the very orderliness. You might say the cold rationality that I or that we take such pride in. Because look at what Paul is not doing here. He is not dismissing unexplainable manifestations of the Spirit, right? Paul's argument is not, let's take tongues and let's take prophetic words from God off of the table because those things are not legit. No, his argument is, let's keep these manifestations of the Spirit. Let's keep them orderly. Do it in a way that benefits the church. You might even notice that in verse 18, as Paul is making his case for restraint, he even says, "I thank God that I speak in tongues more than all of you." Oh. I was born, raised up in, was baptized in, was educated into, have worshiped in, have taught and preached and led in Stone Campbell Restorationist Christian churches, churches of Christ like New Hope. And we are part of a very rational, head-oriented, you might say, tradition of faith. You don't have to know this, but our forefathers were very fond of Enlightenment rationalists like John Locke, and probably even more influenced by the common sense philosophy of Thomas Reid. Just a big emphasis on everything making sense, head sense. Simple, observable truth, so on. The most famous forefather of our tradition is Alexander Campbell, who was one organized thinker, logical and precise, great debater, but a little more reserved when it came to matters of the heart and to emotion and things like tongues. As I was growing up, the two arguments I usually heard regarding tongues and unusual manifestations of the Spirit were, number one, yes, these gifts were real, but as Paul seems to hint in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 8, there may be part of what has to disappear after the time of the apostles. They were there, but now they're gone. Or the second argument I sometimes heard was, no, these are not real. It's actually demons that are making them happen. So in either case, it was nothing allowed outside the rational box. Side note here, kind of funny thing. When the Stone Campbell movement began to take shape on the early American frontier, in frontier tent revivals, one of the frequently reported manifestations of the Spirit was people barking, like a dog, barking uncontrollably. So holy barking. And I think I would have loved to have seen that or to see it happen today. So when our tradition criticizes the charismatics, it's sort of like the barkers calling out the tongue speakers, you know. And then, as one of my seminary professors pointed out, we should note that supposedly ice-cold Alexander Campbell, that he fathered 12 kids. So at least a dozen times he mustered up a little bit of passion, right? Now, you're probably wondering where I'm going with this. This is not my way of announcing a new class at New Hope on how to speak tongues. I do not speak in tongues. I have a hard enough time communicating in ordinary language, as you know. And I don't believe, as some Pentecostals do, that tongues is the sign of the presence of the Holy Spirit. I think Paul makes a very strong case in 1 Corinthians 13 that love is the best sign of spirit possession. I will know you are possessed by God's Spirit when you demonstrate it in the way that you love. But what I am willing to admit is that the older I get, the more reluctant I am to second guess the way that God might be working on other people. There are a lot of people who seem to me to genuinely love Jesus, who seem very capable of self-giving love, and who claim to have the gift of tongues. And I don't think I have the data that a rationalist needs to doubt them. And the older I get, the more receptive I am to the unusual spiritual experiences that other people share with me. Their dreams and visions, prayer experiences, insights, and intuitions. I mean, I certainly don't make other people's experiences front and center in my faith. I don't rely on those. I think our shared story of Christ raised from the dead is the one that guides me and that puts all of us on common ground. But what God is doing in the lives of people who aren't me is up to God. And what God is doing in other places of worship is up to God. This 14th chapter of 1 Corinthians inclines us all, I think, to think about charismatic churches because one of the big issues being addressed in this passage is the gift of tongues. But it actually also leads me to think of another family of churches, one that is in a way completely opposite of charismatics, of Pentecostals. Some of you know that I have an academic interest in Eastern Orthodoxy, especially Russian Orthodoxy. Actually, it's more than an academic interest. It is a philosophical and spiritual interest. I'm sort of touched by some of the things that I learned there. And Orthodox worship seems in a lot of ways to be completely opposite of Pentecostal worship. Charismatic worship tends to be open and free flowing and geared to the spontaneity of the Spirit. The Orthodox, on the other hand, have basically used the same worship service, the Divine Liturgy, every single week for hundreds of years. Charismatics, bodily movement and raised hands and lots of energy. The Orthodox, icons and incense and chant. And to compare those, at first it seems like complete opposite, completely different pages. And yet, what both types of worship share, what both traditions share, is a deep sense of mystery. The sense that God is big, that God transcends even our best theological descriptions, that God is always more, that God is uncontainable. Among Pentecostals, God spills into the room in energy and strange tongues. In Orthodox worship, the mysteries, capital M, the bread and the wine, are brought into the sanctuary from behind the iconostasis, that ornate wall that you see sometimes or see almost always in an Orthodox church, or the gate that is there up front. The bread and the wine come through, and it's as if heaven pours into earth. Quite different traditions. And yet, both convey that, folks, we're dealing here with a God who exceeds rational discourse. Whatever we say, just string together the best things you can come up with theologically. Just try to put it together, but God is going to be more than that. I think that is why one of the leading tools for worship that's been used through the centuries, both before and after Jesus, has been the book of Psalms. Poetry rather than purely rational propositions. That's what the Psalms are. Figurative speech. The kind of language we resort to when we can't seem to say everything we want to say. A language that just hints at things and hopes that the greater reality will somehow slip in between the lines of the poem. That's poetry. Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth in speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. And the rationalist says, so what you're saying is nature sort of suggests that there's a God. And the poet says, no, I'm saying the heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Quit trying to flatten everything. You sound like you don't know what kind of God we're dealing with here. For all the problems that are noted here in 1 Corinthians 14, what strikes me as a positive in Corinth, and I think it's perhaps the thing that made the Corinthians so lovable to Paul. But what strikes me as their positive is that they know that they are serving a very big God, a God who is intervening in their lives in very powerful, unmistakable ways. God was literally alive among them and on exhibit through them. So everybody in the church wanted to get in the act. They were competing to show God at work in them. It's a wonderful moment in Mark's gospel that I've always taken as sort of the ideal template for worship. Early in Mark 6, Jesus sends his disciples out into the world to teach and to heal just as he had been doing. And then in verse 30, they returned from their venture, and it says the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. All the things they'd seen, all the stuff that had happened. Pretty cool order of worship, don't you think? Gather around Jesus and report what God has been doing in your life. What has the Holy Spirit done to you lately? What is our amazing God doing through you? And maybe that's sort of the order of Corinthian worship. What holy stuff's happening, folks? Let her rip. The service has begun. I suspect that the reason that we don't have much of that is not so much the matter that God is not doing anything in your lives. I think we just sort of filter that part of things out. We should definitely work toward more of those what do you have to say moments in our worship. And sometimes the sermon is just as much for me as it is for you. And that would seem to be a to-do item for me and for worship planners and elders, I suppose. Or it could work out this way if you just want to get all Corinthian on things. Just jump up during the sermon, interrupt me, and say what God is doing in your life. Maybe that's what will have to happen. The thing that I want to close with, though, and it's the thing that the Corinthians certainly knew, and it's the thing we can learn from, is that when we come to worship, we're coming before a very big and powerful and incomprehensible God. We're dealing with a God who certainly transcends our rational limits. You do not have enough brain to comprehend this God. When we worship, we are singing to and praying to and listening to the God who created heaven and earth, the God who delivered Israel from mighty Pharaoh, the God who rolled back the waters of the Red Sea, the God who led wanderers in the desert by cloud and fire and dropped manna on them, the God who spoke through the prophets, the God who became flesh in Jesus, the unbegotten Son of the Father, the Son who is both fully God and fully human, simultaneous. God who is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and who is nevertheless one true God. God who heals the sick. God who raises people from the dead. God who raised his Son from death. God whose own divine energy, the Spirit, is unleashed on people. God who reigns over heaven and earth. Whenever we come to worship, that's who we're singing and praying and listening to. All those things that I just said are said using ordinary, common sense kind of speech, and yet the things said in each of those items are anything but ordinary. The how of it all eludes us. And even though this God chooses to reveal himself to us most perfectly and completely in the person of Jesus, it is never as though we perfectly comprehend him, comprehend God in all of his fullness. We never encapsulate him in our theological descriptions. We never domesticate this God and bring him under our control. He's big. And there's always something of a mystery to him. And we should worship God, I think, as much for what we can't understand as for what we can understand.